Thanks everybody for coming to see us. Welcome to our 3D Lithogeochemistry webinar part 2. As you guys remember from last week, I'm Sam Scher. I am the principal consultant at LKI Consulting and the host of Geochemistry. I'm a geochemist, a spectroscopist, and a modeling enthusiast. Putra Sadikin is the product manager at Imdex ioGAS. He's also a geochemist and works in software development. And then Julia Oliveira is the senior technical leader in Latin America at Sequent. She's a 3D modeler and geologist. We have so much to do today that if you guys really want to know all about us, go to our LinkedIn or go to part 1 of the series, which is now on our YouTube page. And you can hear all about us, but let's go. In terms of our webinar workflow for today, last week we did everything from presenting you what our challenge was, giving you some of the background geology, looking at all the drill hole review, QA/QC for both the geology, the geochemistry, and the drill holes themselves. It was really this kind of not intense but intense look at how important all this QA/QC is, all the different fails along the way where we were just learning about our data set and about our geochemistry and our 3D model. But this week we're going to be looking at generating a geologic model from the drill hole data and interpreting our geochemical data and kind of tying that back in together to create this improved lithogeochemical 3D model that I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of, and I'm so glad that so many people are interested in having a look at the way in which you would go about creating this. I think most importantly here, though, you see in this diagram here how this is a feedback loop, right? So as we're going through all this, you have this little bottom right-hand corner where you're sharing your geologic models, you're sharing your interpretation with the different stakeholders for review and collaboration. And this is just fluid. It's always, I mean, the amount of back and forth that you have to go until you arrive at your final product can be a task in itself. And it's so important to work in teams for this. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Putra now, and he'll take you through about 30 minutes of geochemistry to really show you what lithogeochemistry is and all the different diagrams potentially that you can use, how you can feel confident in how you're going to be attributing your samples, and really also how we're going to be interacting with our 3D modeler, in this case with Julia, to create this fit for purpose model. So at this point, Putra, I'm going to transfer it over to you. And when you feel like you've done enough, then we'll throw it over to Julia, where she's then going to talk to us about kind of these last steps in her 3D model creation.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sam. Let me just share my screen and we'll go from there. Everyone can see and hear my screen. Okay? Awesome. All right. So welcome again to the second part of this webinar. So we covered a lot about just quality check on your geochem data at the end of the last webinar. And that sort of forms the first step in sort of a lithogeochemical characterization workflow. So our goal in this workflow is basically two things. So we're trying to identify a primary and secondary geological process that we can model using lithogeochemistry data. So some definitions, which we have talked about a bit in our last webinar. So with the lithogeochemistry data, it's not just about getting your assay data from the lab, but it's also about putting it in the same context as your log geology, your log alteration, and things like that. But also that spatial context, the location of your samples in 3D space, which can allow you to get a bit of a sense as to what the geochemistry means in terms of the geology. So where we finished off last webinars, we did that workflow with the data doctor, and I'm not going to go through the same process again, but I'm just going to automate sort of that process, right? So if you remember from the last time we did it, we did a bit of a data doctor exercise where we replace the data that's below the detection limit, and if there are samples that are missing or samples not received in the data. And being a historical data set, this is sort of the thing that you tend to deal with on a regular basis. I'm not going to go through the same workflow, but I'm going to use a macro that I recorded just before this webinar, and it allowed me to sort of replicate what I did in the last webinar without going through each of those steps. So this is a new thing that we've added a couple of versions ago in version 8. So it's sort of a workflow recorder, what we call it as the workflow recorder, but some people refer to it as the macro player. But it basically allows me to run through each of these steps. And if you see the change log, it basically just does whatever it is that I did in the first webinar, but just do it in one click because I've already recorded the actions. All right, so we don't need to do that adapter again. So as you bring up that adapter, it's all clear. So we can just jump straight into the geochem. Okay, so the goal that we're trying to first achieve here is to try to identify that primary geological process. So I would call this the lithology workflow. So if you remember from the last webinar, so Sam gave a really good overview of the geology of it, albeit briefly, but it's basically a complex sequence of felsic and basalt-dominated heterolithic volcanic plastic rocks. Sorry, and that complexity, if we look at it from a modeling sort of perspective, we can try to simplify that relationship using simple geochemical ratios, for example. And the first part of this exercise is to try to identify which elements which can be useful in distinguishing between our igneous rocks that we have in this data. So we know that elements like SiO2, Fe2O3, MgO. So all of these major element oxides, this can be quite useful in trying to determine the difference between those igneous rocks. And we can use that sort of as a starting point. So that's what I'm going to do now. So I'm just going to select a few of these elements, and I'm going to see where they plot sort of in 3D space, but also at the same time plotting them up in a scatter plot matrix like this. All right. And when we change the colors of this back to the lithology groups, we can start to see some pretty obvious trends. Okay, so if you bring up the scatter plot of iron versus silica, and I'm just going to change the color of this just to make it a bit clearer. And I'm just going to turn the attributes on and off just for a bit of context. So your felsic igneous rocks would obviously have a higher SiO2 value, and your mafic igneous rocks in general would have a lower SiO2 value and higher Fe2O3. So that's the most simplistic way that we can describe the difference between your felsic and mafic sequences. But being the flin-flon area and with the sort of alteration we're dealing with, and that's something that we're going to touch on briefly later on, is that we're seeing a lot of chloride alteration in the area, which may affect the result of the use of some of these elements. So when we look at using elements like iron and magnesium, for example, and elements like potassium and sodium, all of those elements, they get moved around a lot in a heavily altered setting. And even though we're using a log ratio here to look at the difference between those major rock types, one of the things that I like to do is try to compare the use of some of these elements with something that's more robust in an area where you have a lot of alteration and weathering. So when you try to plot this using your immobile elements, so you have a selection of elements like titanium, zirconium, yttrium, niobium. So all of those elements that you'll be familiar with to be quite immobile in sort of an altered sort of VMS type setting. And if we try to plot them up in a probability plot like this, you can kind of see which elements that you can use for this purpose. So not a lot of these elements would be useful, right? Because as you can see, elements like tantalum and thorium here in niobium, with the detection limit that they have, it's not exactly the best sort of elements to use. So if we just stick with titanium and zirconium for now, and we use those as sort of our basis for the next work that we're going to do. But let's pick yttrium as well, because that can be quite good, just based on that distribution. So I would just like to first plot them up in a probability plot, and just to kind of check their distribution, first of all, if the distribution is okay enough to use in the scatter plot matrix, because heavily quantized data in the lower ranges, it would look kind of funny in the scatter plot matrix, right? So got to put that into account. So when we start plotting things up in sort of a scatter plot of your immobile trace elements, this is the sort of things that you can do, right? So you can start to see the same pattern that you would see earlier in the Fe2O3 versus SiO2 plot, but there's a bit of more of robustness to it, especially when we're looking at some of the digestion methods that we use in here. So we got both ICP and XRF, and with some of the minerals that were digested using these methods, even though it doesn't digest fully a couple of these elements like titanium and zirconium, um, the ratios between them should still be robust enough for us to identify prothyllites in these rocks. So, and to identify geological process related to fractionation, for example. So if we cast our attention just on this first scatter plot, so zirconium versus titanium, you can kind of see a number of linear trends in here. So that's the sort of thing that we would expect to see. So when you see a bunch of linear trends coming from the origin, those are fractionation trends, where you basically represent partial crystallization of those minerals that would fractionate as you go from that felsic to mafic trend. And this context is well represented in this data set, which you can see if I just lock my view. And if I just go, your felsic igneous rocks will mostly be here in the top. And your mafic igneous rocks would mostly be here. So this ratio is what is used to construct a geochem classification diagram, right? So if you've used ioGAS before, you'll be familiar with some of these contexts, right? So you're using immobile element ratios to construct diagrams, like the titanium versus zirconium Halbrecht classification diagram. So Halbrecht's work in WA allowed him to characterize different types of heavily altered, heavily weathered igneous rocks based on that magmatic fractionation trend, which allows him to put classification regions. And in ioGAS, that's represented in the different polygons that we see here in this diagram, right? So if we just turn off our samples one at a time, so where we see where our mafic igneous rocks are plotting, they're mostly plotting within the basalt field, but you can also see ones that are plotting above with a higher zirconium to titanium ratio. And what that means is we may be seeing a bit of a mislog or a classification that's a bit too general, that tends to lump everything into the same into a homogeneous unit. So what the workflow that we're going to do now is we're going to try to relog some of these rocks, and in the process we're going to compare the result with the log geology itself. So it's sort of a loop where we try to characterize the rocks using the geochem and going back to the log geology and seeing why they're different, and then see if we can adjust the original logging. So that's the usual feedback loop that we do with this sort of thing. And if you guys use the ioGAS Leapfrog LifeLink, that would be the sort of workflow that you do anyway. So this is a way of structuring sort of that process, right? So let's start with trying to just characterize the rocks that are not sedimentary. So as we can see here, I got a bunch of rock types, a bunch of log rock types, and one of it is sedimentary rock. So I'm just going to turn that up, and I'm going to create a couple of new groups in here. So I'm going to keep it basic. I'm just going to call it felsic. I'm going to call it mafic. And there's actually gabbro in here as well, which has distinctively high chromium value. And we also have sedimentary rocks, right? So the workflow is, we got the diagram like this to serve as our guide. We are not going to use the exact boundaries defined by these fields. So one thing to keep in mind is that when you're using one of these classification diagrams in ioGAS, you tend not to want to use the polygon boundaries as a gospel, really, but you use them as a guide. You don't want to take the boundaries too hard, because they were derived based on the data that was used to create these diagrams in the first place, and it may not be relevant to your data unless you're dealing with the exact same geology that the author was dealing with. So don't take these boundaries seriously, but you you should, but you also want to use them only as a guide almost, right? So we're using it as a guide, and we know that there's
one thing just
yes.
point out here, Pucha, is also,
Yeah.
you know, if this diagram was made from, sorry, my finger's so big right here. If this diagram was made using a whole rock package versus 4-acid versus aqua regia, understanding what your digest was to start with is super important, because this diagram might not be appropriate at all for you to use. So it's important to read the metadata and the different diagrams that ioGAS has.
That's correct, and that's exactly a good point, because this Halberg diagram was definitely not created using aqua regia data. So and we get cases where people try to plot their aqua regia data on this type of diagram and other diagrams as well, and it doesn't give them the result that they expect. And there's a couple of things that can go into that, right? And one of it is the different sample prep, and the different analytical method that you have versus what was used to create those diagrams in the first place. So something to keep in mind. And if you're not certain, just let us know and we can guide you through it, right? So, all right. So we know that in this area, there's not a lot of intermediate rocks. There's more felsic and mafic rocks. So we're just trying to generalize between that felsic, mafic, gabbro, and sedimentary trends, and we can use that as a starting point, and we can see if they're geologically coherent. So we use this region right here. So I'm just turning on the point density. So I'm just going to create a felsic sort of group on this point cluster of data. And I'm going to do the same thing with the one below that. It's going to color them as mafic. Okay, so we use that as a starting point. And let's turn off my points. So I like to use that point density thing because it gives me a bit of a guidance. And then let's look at our plot of chromium. So let's look at, let me just try to plot. So TiO2 is pretty good just in terms of its precision. I'm going to plot it against CR203, put it in a scatter plot. So the one that has higher CR203 values are probably gabbro. I'm going to assign that to its own group right here. And we can see how geologically coherent they are, right? And then let's turn on sedimentary rocks, and everything else can just belong to sedimentary. And
yeah,
there
I
you
love
go.
how that you did this, Puja, in the sense that you took away something sedimentary that's clearly going to be very different and going to kind of throw off everything. So you said, no, I'm going to filter this out. And then the next step you said, even though, gabbro, relatively mafic, but you had already looked at all these different bivariate plots, and you said, okay, I'm going to put this on hold for a second. I'm going to split out my mafics, but I know that step 2, there's another plot that will help me, divide out this other really important unit. And I think that's just such a great point for people to understand that, like, yes, you could have broken down this Halsberg diagram into, maybe 5 or 6 clusters on its own, but it's also about stacking different plots, different observations against each other, because they all tell you a little bit something different. So, definitely look at your data, hang out with it, and just, try and see what it's actually trying to tell you.
That's right.
But also,
And knowing,
it can be simple.
yeah, knowing which elements are useful for all cases, right? Because if you see from here, the ones that you log as gabbro plot neatly within the mafic sort of area in here in this diagram, and you wouldn't be able to pick it out otherwise unless you plot some other elements to play around with, like CR203. So always have a sort of a starting point, and then have a set of elements that might be useful in this sort of area, and you go from there. And you tend not to want to look at just one plot at a time, but you want to look at multiple plots and adjust those groupings as you go. And ioGAS just makes it easy for you to do this sort of work. All right, so let's move on. Next step is to try to reclassify our data, and just create a new lithology column based on this. So I'm going to call this just Litho1 webinar, just in case it conflicts with another column of the same name. So, and we know that we created this on the second day of the webinar. So I've created the new text column based on this. So if you saw, I guess, before, you're familiar with this workflow. So you're basically flagging each row in the data with the information that you have in the attribute manager, and you create that as a new column in the file. And what that allows you to do is you can compare how this plots with the log geology, right? I might have closed Leapfrog earlier, but that's fine. Let's just move on. Let's move on to the ioGAS part. And I'll talk about the sort of overarching sort of a workflow at the end. So let's move on to sort of the alteration workflow after this. But before I do that, I'm just going to show you a bit of a spatial context as to what we're trying to do here. So when we try to describe the litho class that was based on lithology logging, and we can compare that against the classification work that we just did. So what I like to do is show you how we can look at the data. So this is just a plan view of our drill holes. I'm just going to select a few holes in here. And actually, let me just try to make that a bit more distinct. And I'm going to use this for my drill hole selection. I'm going to plot them in my new drill hole plot in ioGAS. So this is a new thing that we've added in version 8.2 in ioGAS, which allows you to compare. So the one on the left, that's the log geology, and the one on the middle, that's the classification that we did just now. You just using those bivariate plots. And the area where we highlighted as, Gabbro, that's consistent with the, sorry, on the right is a more detailed lithology logging. And on the very left, that's the summarized logging. So this allows you to sort of see how consistent your logging are based on that geochem characterization compared to the logging that was done. All right, so that's just a really quick way of looking at how consistent your logging are and how consistent they are spatially as well. So let's try and do a bit of an alteration workflow. So ioGAS actually has a number of useful alteration diagrams that we have in here, and people use a lot of the molar ratio plots in ioGAS and that sort of thing. So we're going to try to compare two different approaches here, and one of it is by using an alteration box plot. So this is a classic. It's by Ross Large. It's used mostly in VMS type setting. So the sort of alteration trends that we're trying to describe here. So think of it as having three arrows, right? So you have an arrow that goes sort of a diagonal from the box in the middle. So the box in the middle is your unaltered rocks or least altered rocks, not unaltered, but least altered. And the diagonal that goes to the top right, that's your chloride, sericite, chloride, sericite, pyrite trend. And then over here on the horizontal, you have that sort of mild ceritization trend. And then on the vertical, just on the right here, where my mouse is, that's sort of your sericite to chloride trend. So you have three trends that you're trying to describe in here. And what we're going to do is we're going to just highlight those trends fairly quickly. So you have, it's going to use shorthand just to make it a bit quicker. So you get that chloride trend, basically. So that's that diagonal trend that I was talking about earlier. So I would describe it as sort of this trend. And then you have that ceritization trend, which is sort of the horizontal trend that what it's describing here. And then you have that sericite to chloride trend. Okay, and we're using what this diagram describes is the alteration index and the CCPI index, which kind of describes that destruction of feldspar minerals and the development of sericite and chloride in VMS type settings. And if you're ever in doubt as to what any of the diagrams in ioGAS does, just click on this little button on the right and it tells you what it is and where you can see more information about it. But it can generally be used to describe hydrothermal alteration in this type of rocks. And the area that you're interested in this diagram is sort of in the upper right-hand corner, where you're describing all the processes that has to do with this. And the numbers that you should be looking out for in this diagram is where you have an AI alteration index, higher than 90 and CCPF higher than 90. And that's where you're starting to describe a lot of these alteration trends that are prevalent in the footwall setting of this type of deposits. Okay, not going to go into too much detail, but what we're going to do now is we're going to create a new alteration sort of logging by Geochem. So I'm just going to call it Alteration Geochem. Oops. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing as I did before, but I'm going to order this a bit differently. So I'm going to start with the log geology classes, lithology description, and then follow that on with my geochem lithologging, and then follow that on by alteration geochem. And once we plot them up in a plot like this, what you find interesting is that the ones that we log as gabbro, for example, um, we actually plot as that chloride trend. So this is actually a very useful feedback loop, because what this actually represents is gabbro tends to be higher in a lot of those elements that are contributing to higher AI and CCPI values. So if you can see from here, I'm sorry. So if you can see from here, we're describing magnesium, magnesium and iron as the numerator, so the top half of the ratio in both axes. And what that means, as you increase magnesium and iron, those are the two elements that are actually quite distinctive in gabbro kind of rocks. Right? So if you plot a simple scatter plot of MgO and iron, and if you look at your rock type, for example, and if you see where gabbro is sort of sitting, your gabbro is actually kind of sitting with the super high MgO values, right? And the ones that you log as gabbro geochemically, which is consistent with the actual logged gabbro, actually exhibits as higher alteration index. And that's quite a dangerous thing and you can see where they plot in this alteration box plot. And that's one thing that you'll need to watch out for, because certain element signatures that correspond to a different primary geological process can also influence or are relevant to the elements that you use to describe alteration process. So it's important to distinguish between the two processes and know which elements are responsible for making those indices and those ratios that you use in either one move. So those things that you really need to keep in mind. Okay. All right. So that's my second part. And I got a few more minutes, so I'm just going to wrap this up with sort of the sort of a more data sciencey type approach, or as I call it, the sort of that brute force approach, right? So, and it's actually one of my favorite sort of approach to do in ioGAS, because it allows me to do pretty cool stuff using some of the newer things that we've added in ioGAS, like UMAP, k-means clustering, dbScan clustering, and that sort of thing. I'm not going to go into too much detail about those techniques. If you're ever interested, you can watch any of the webinars that we did. And for interest of time, I have a selected list of elements that I know are multivariate. So you have assay values roughly across most of the rows in the data. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to plot. I'm not going to talk to this in too much detail, but this is a nonlinear dimension reduction technique called UMAP, and it's a great technique that allows you to understand the clusters, or the underlying structure in your data, and trying to understand exactly why we have these structures in the first place, right? So it's a nonlinear dimension reduction technique. It's a manifold-based technique, which means that it's really quite useful in understanding patterns and structures in the data where you wouldn't have easily otherwise pick up using something like PCA, which only looked at the linear projection of the data, right? So, and the UMAP identifies quite distinct clusters. So we have, 4 major clusters that you can see here, right? So you got this cluster, and this cluster. Some of it is quite obvious. So I'm just going to change my sedimentary rock to a different color. So your sedimentary rock, that's this guy right there, right? So that's your sedimentary rocks. It's a bit harder to distinguish between your felsic and mafic rocks. And you can see here, there's actually 2 different populations. So that's your felsic rocks in purple, and your mafic rocks are here. But what you see is that your igneous rocks are actually in 2 different clusters. But this is not a geological process. What they are is, if I change the color in this into lab method or assay method, the clusters are actually not geologically relevant. So the clusters are actually based on the different assay lab method, and it's quite distinct, right? So this is one thing to note out for when you start to use AI and data science type methods in your geochem data. You really got to understand the structure in your data a bit more before you start using some of these tools, because even the simplest difference, like the different lab method, can result in vastly different embedding, right, in your low dimensional space. And if you're more familiar with PCA, I'm gonna plot up an example of PCA, and you can see this bang on, right? So what explains the difference, right? So obviously you have very different detection limit across two methods, right? So you got tin, for example, even things like tungsten, scandium. So this is a very evil example, if I have to say so myself. So you got a vastly different set of response across a lot of these elements, which is actually pushing that signal that's being represented in both the UMAP and the biplot. So you can see how the eigenvectors are pushing the data across between the two different clusters, like scan-DMC. You see this arrow that goes downwards. So that explains how you have those two different clusters in here, which is not geologically relevant, but they're based on a variation in your assay method. So I would leave that there, sort of just a word of caution as to what you may need to look out for when you start looking at your geochem data properly. So you got to know, you got to understand the context of your data first. You want to know which elements you want to use beforehand. There's of course value in doing rough EDA. It's like throwing pasta at the wall and seeing which one sticks, right? So that's that approach as well. But it's better to know the geology, and if you understand a bit about the geology, you'll know which elements to use to start to look at. And that will also guide you into what sort of assay method will be useful for my program, whether that will give me the best bang for your buck. You don't want to go overboard, but you don't want to skimp out too little as well. You don't want to pick the cheapest assay method because you still want to describe something that's useful to your geology. So you got to understand that. And then if you're dealing with a large volume of historical data sets, always try to understand where your data comes from, because it avoids you from making interpretation like this, when you run it through an ML algorithm and you start to think, oh, I have 3 different rock types in here, but it's not. It's really actually just very simple. You can split it between, your felsic, gabbro-mafic, sedimentary, just those simple rock types. And you can see that they belong in 2 clusters because of the different assay methods. But yeah, I would just leave it there. But yeah, over to you, Sam and Julia.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's just such a great way also to bring it back to day one, which is just that, we spent so long talking about how to properly look at your historic data sets and how important it is. And it really just shows that if you were to not also investigate your data using just very simple univariate and bivariate statistics, you could just end up in quite the conundrum where you presented now a solution which actually is not meaningful. So thank you so much. And Julia, let's go to you. So how do we then now take this data and model it?
So I'm sharing my screen starting with Central because where Putra sent the data to me and send the analysis, but for me, it was not enough having just Putra's opinion. I knew that I had a brilliant consultant next to us, and I wanted to know a little bit more what she thought about the model, right? About the data when I was super lost, as I told last time, and 3 heads think better than one. So in Central, I sent to Sam, let me open here my Central. I sent to Sam some comments. Let me see what's the ID that I'm working, 670. I'm gonna open in the viewer. Let's open in the viewer. Here we go. 670. So I'm opening the viewer where we start our discussion. So I sent a viewer to Sam. Sam, as I told before, was without a Leapfrog license. And I sent to her the information we had, and I start making some questions. So as you can see, I just sent Sam was added in the model, and I sent to Sam, hey Sam, how she could support us. And we started a discussion where Sam gave me, together with Putra, some recommendations. So she recommended me to looking at the downhole original 25 lithologies, the shapes, the Lithogeochem, and commenting a few scenarios that Putra also commented. And I was wondering, Sam, can you tell us a little bit what was behind your comments and what did you saw that I didn't? That why did you gave us these recommendations?
I think the simplest one was definitely your questions about making some numerical models, and that, just the easiest way to just get right in there for this was just to model our different ore elements, which should have been in this case the copper, lead, and zinc. And then I had a quick look through of the other elements to look at typical Pathfinder elements for VMS deposits. And so for that one, I really just was turning things on and off and seeing which would be the best ones to create some numerical models out of, because that would also help us understand a bit more about our mineral system and how, that part of it was changing. As for with the lithogeochem part, when Julia had first showed me her model, is that what we're looking at? That's really cool.
No, yeah.
When Julia had first showed me her model, I think model round 3, she had this really interesting stratigraphic model going on at that point. And I think that was hugely helpful for trying to understand this deposit the three of us had never really actually even seen before. So it was helpful to really understand the stratigraphy. But then at that point, it's like, okay, we have the stratigraphy, but where does lithogeochem come into play? And that's something that Julia really didn't have any knowledge of, having worked before. So my next part of this was really trying to describe to Julia how a great integrated lithogeochemical model would be made. And that's to say that it's something supplementary to your geology. Your first thing is like, okay, did we identify these different units correctly? But the other part of this is within some of these units, are there ways that we can break them apart that gives us even more information? In this case, is one of those is potentially, did we have 2 gabbro units, and one gabbro was super important for the zinc and the other one meant nothing for it? So it's a really interesting way to both improve 3D models, but also to explore your data. And so a lot of this was just kind of me out loud in text chatting with Julie about just dumping some of those ideas, her revising them, and then, us kind of getting together the next day, 2 days later, when she had time to digest those comments, and then, going forth and working on her model from there.
Yeah, and after Sam gave the comments, I start like it's funny because you start having ideas, right? When people give you like a few comments, and that doesn't need much. I sent it what I had to her and to Putra. I put it some comments. I tagged where I had my doubts, and then I came back to them and asked a few questions. And with that, I had my first idea. So I decided to group some lithologies because it's always easier after knowing how should I group this lithology was the important part. And with Putra analysis of the types of rocks, it started making sense and like putting together the ideas. And I decided to group thinking about the like the literature that I read about it and all in some groups. And for that, you just go into Leapfrog, you create a new column, and you do a group lithology. And when you do a group lithology, it's going to show all the lithologies here on your right hand. And then you just need to create a group. So you do, I'm going to do one for you guys. Let's delete the one that is quite easy. Oh no, I'm going to delete the model. I'm not going to do that. I'm sorry. I don't want to delete my model. So you just go in new group, and then you're going to create and just throw on your right hand what lithology is that. And I grouped a few lithologies, and I created 4 groups, 4 big groups that was easy to start understanding the lithology. I gave OK, and I had a new table that is this table that is here. What is fun about this, if you get lost and you don't know how people created, let's say that Sam received my model and she needs to understand my train of thoughts. She can come just here and see like, oh, she created this column. And how Sam knows that? It's a triangle here. She just opened this and oh, she created one. Double click on top, it's gonna open what I grouped. And under that is where I brought the information from. So if I click here, it's gonna throw and show and mark, oh, it came from that table. So it came from this interpretation that we found that I analyzed together with a Lithogeochem. And I created these 4 groups where I had boundary intrusions, flim flown, assemblage, hidden formations, and Louis. Where I took this name from? I took this name from cross-section and some maps that I found from flim flown. And what helped me was Putra analysis, actually. I got Putra analysis, I checked the map, I saw the lithology, the geochem, how it worked, and then I was sure in how I should group it. So I had the knowledge, and of course with Sam's comments. So I put it different pieces together to be able to do that. And with that, not happy enough, I decided to start my model. I really like always to start not just geological modeling. If I have a model that is really dependent of faults, I really like to have my faults before that. I understand the zones that I will be able to model or not. So the first thing that I did was creating a simple fault model where I had the meshes. I don't know if you guys remember the meshes that I was going crazy about. And the first thing I wanted to recognize the 3 principles faults that we had. That was the Channing fault, the Cliff Lake fault, and the Flim Flon fault. These were the 3 principal faults that we had. And how I created this model, just I brought the faults, they were as meshes. And how do we know that? We have the points here, but again, remember, last time I told you guys when we have problems in our triangulations, you can do by points. You can use the points of these triangulations. And how I will take that out, let's go to meshes, and you just go right click, and you're gonna extract vertices. And you can use that for model 2 to triangulate. You don't need to use the mesh if the triangulators are broken. Triangulation, sorry. So I brought in fault system, I created a new fault from points in this case, and I brought this tree. And from that, I created the faults. And then we have a trick that is important to know. I created 3 lithologies too. Block 1, block 2, block 3, block 4. Because when I put these 3 faults on the model, I'm gonna put the box for you guys to understand what I'm talking about. I knew that this would break in 4 blocks. Can you guys see? So we have 4 blocks. So knowing that, I wanted to be painted in different colors for me to be able to identify and to combine and to understand the relationships between those faults. So I created 4 lithologies as the names of the blocks. And to do that, how do you do that? You just come here, lithologies, and you're gonna create a new lithology, just plus, and you create a new code, okay? Let's delete this one that I created. And with that, I came here and I just turn on my faults that I brought in the order that they should cross. This is very important for you guys to know. And how we're gonna know the order of the faults? Reading, find information about studies and understand how it should cross each fault with each other. So can you see, like, I can be like the master of Leapfrog. If I don't know the geology, all my master of the software would be worth it. So here created, and I had my first model broken in 4 parts. That is here. So I created this model. In parallel, what I did, I created my lithology model, but this one is a little bit more complicated because first I created a simple model with a few lithologies, and then I decided to refine. What does it mean? I had the big lithologies, and then I detailed inside of these big lithologies, knowing that I would have more detail. So the first lithology, the first model that I created was the, oops, let me leave it with all the triangulations. So I created my model that, in my personal opinion, is very beautiful. If you guys put the geological model, it's very similar. So I'm gonna be very humble here in this one. It was not an easy one. I did some tricks, okay? I'm gonna be super honest with you guys. It was not like a fundamentals course model to do. So how I did, I used that table that we knew already, that is the strat, this one. So how do I know that? I just, Leapfrog is quite easy on that. Just open all the triangles and you're gonna see where it came from. And always the last one is the one. When I grade it, don't get frustrated because it came like Mr. Bubbles. And I was like, that's not the format that it should be, this lithology. And when I was reading, I knew that most of the lithologies were dependent of the structure. So I created structural discs to do the format and to bring a little bit more alive, I would say, or with a geological format. So how I created these structural discs. What is fun from the points in Leapfrog is that each point can be transformed in structural discs. And how do we do that? Quite easy. You just come here, right click, and you're gonna create new structural disks, estimate structural data from points. When you do that, it will automatic create you structural disks that will show up here. So for example, the eye structural, it came from one fault. Can you guys recognize my fault here? And you have hidden structural, the other one, and top lagoon was the other one. These three was the one that were changing the lithology and giving the format where the intrusion just came and was placed on it. So with that, we created the tree. So I created from the drill holes, and then I came here and then I added my structural discs on my lithology. So I had something that was quite Mr. Bubbles, and right click, add structural data. When I added the structural data, it gave this beautiful format that is very geological. And the same with the Louis. Oops, I'm sorry. I don't want you guys to see that. I want to see that. See? And the same for the hidden information. Here you go. I just asked to use the tendency of that, and the tendency is going to be used for the whole model. I didn't use any polylines. I'm kind of against the polylines, to be honest. I don't like it. And from that, I wanted more details. So I decided to refine my model. And how do you do a refined model? So the refined models, we always go on the geological model, and you could do a new refined model, and you're gonna have a original model, and you're gonna be able to model inside of that. We don't have much time. In another moment, if you guys have any doubts about refined models, I can show you guys how to do it, but I will show the results. That was a model that I have with. So I use the reclass, and that was not the result that I wanted to show you guys, but I have a question too that I can support. in 1 minute. So here you go. So I used the table recommended by Putra and Sam, and I created the model refined for each lithology. So when you put it here, you can see that this lithology is refined and detailed, and Louis, same thing for Louis, same thing for Hidden, and same thing for Flim-Flom, but Flim-Flom was almost the same thing. So you have a much more detailed model than we had before. Let me cut it. I want to show with a cut so you guys can see how it goes a little bit. Change our model top down. So it's much more refined. And we could refine and beam plane that with all the elements. It's much more that we could do in this model. For example, we didn't do that, but we could do numeric models that I know that Sam used a lot this tool. Maybe you could comment a little bit because Sam is really good in that. And I think part of her analysis in all of her works have been done in new interpolant, new indicator. She's a big fan of that, right, Sam?
I mean, so it's interesting. It's not something that we would necessarily need for this model per
Yeah.
se, but I do a lot of work with hyperspectral data. And with that, that's numeric data. And so for alteration models, and a lot of times you can get your alteration that you've logged exported in like an intensity table. So for non-hyperspectral active minerals like K feldspar, like you want that in, say, a porphyry model. So you have that, plus then you have your hyperspectral data, your white mica, your chlorate, that you can get exported. That's exported as a table as well. So with the numeric models, lately I've been finding it very interesting to start with a bunch of these numeric models and tighten them up in there, and then to go in and create geologic models for the to make it really simple for the propylitic, for the phyllic, and the potassic zone, and just adding those numeric models into there. So it's just a different way to use your data. In this case, with like this kind of lithogeochem, I'm not sure. I don't really think I would necessarily use the numeric
That's why.
model
But I
part,
think,
but I have found them very useful in a geologic, well, in an alteration modeling sense.
Yeah, you can also, if I can jump in just there for it
Yeah.
quickly, the alteration index that we came up with in ioGAS earlier, we've had experience of using that as the input for the RBF interpolant, and that's quite a useful metric to do because, and I've actually done it on this data set before in the past, where you see those AI alteration index higher than about 90, those RBF interpolants will be right in the middle of the two faults that we have in this data set. So if you've seen this data set a bit before, so we have two faults that are bounding the higher degree of alteration. So the Flin-Flon Lake tailing pond fault lower and the tailing pond fault upper. So those two faults are actually bounding the areas of higher alteration.
I'm
Interesting.
gonna do something really fun here in the next few
Yeah.
minutes. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna open this model to public, and you guys gonna be able to see it on the screen. I'm gonna put it here so you guys can play a little bit with the model, and while Sam close up. But the idea, I'm gonna stop sharing. It's a little bit of that. We could have done more things. I think this analysis could go forever and ever as anything in geology. But the connection, I think, is the base of our work here. It's fundamental to be able to have as much as information you can, but if you don't know how to analyze that, or don't know the geology, or don't know how to use the best tools and the tools that you have, I think it's not worth it. It's a triangle of knowledge that you must have, and it's always necessary. Sam, if you want to close up while I share with everyone the model.
Oh, that's so fun. I didn't know
Yeah.
that's like an extra special treat that we're getting.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, everybody, I just want to thank you guys all for coming for last week. For this week, we realized really quickly we couldn't do this as a one-part webinar. But hey, 2 days of geochem and modeling, I mean, how much fun is that? So yeah, no, we just want to thank you guys for coming. And I personally wanted to give this webinar because I think that, like I said, that the idea of lithogeochemistry, I think it belongs to everybody, to all geoscientists. And I'm not promising anything, but if there are topics that you guys want to explore more, I'm always thrilled to continue the mentorship and try and find people to pull along with me to make it more exciting, because everybody knows something different. So in this case, we had a team of 3. We had a modeler, we had an expert, the person that's pretty much ran ioGAS last decade. So yeah, I thought this would be really neat. And yeah, I'm glad that I got to share this all with you. So thank you for coming. And thank you, Julia, and thank you, Puja, for coming on this journey.
That was my pleasure. It was great to be able to, run through this workflow again. It's something that as I mentioned, last time we did this was during COVID. So yeah, and we know it's a pretty popular live link, right? So yeah. Happy to share any knowledge.
No, I love that. Yeah, I love the live link. I love the live link between the 2 softwares. I use it all the time. And that's like another like cool thing to be able to share with people, just so that they can see that, this is just a way that they can work.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions or anything, please don't doubt of reaching us. I'm always happy to talk and share and whatever you guys want to talk about, from Leapfrog or any sequent questions or modeling questions or anything like that. I'm happy to just reach me on LinkedIn. Happy to talk about it. And Sam and Putra, thank you for the experience. It was amazing working with you both, as usual. So I hope we can do other webinars in the future.
Yeah.
Yes, we should.
Yeah, that's what I said, guys. You guys came for, 2 days to come and listen to us. So, whatever you want to hear next, you guys are the audience. You're the ones that want to learn, and we're happy to help. All right, so I'll sign off here. Thank you, guys. And yeah, I will post this to my YouTube, and I'll be posting that both on LinkedIn, and also I'll send everybody a thank you for coming to the webinar, which will have the links to all the stuff so you guys can follow up.
Thank you all.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Ciao.